a thin whisper of frost, slicing through the corridors of Valharys. Settling, unseen executioner. Outside, the wind howled, a choir of frozen souls shrieking against the towering ice walls of the palace. Princess Sylvain Valharys exhaled, and even that simple act felt like surrender. The breath crystallized before her, tiny fractals of ice forming in the air, except they weren't responding. Her power, once absolute, once a force that could sculpt glaciers and summon blizzards, lay dormant. She clenched her fists, nails digging into her palm. Not like this. In the vast hall of the frozen spire, the court gathered in a formal assembly, bathed in the blue-white glow of the ice chandeliers above. The king, her father, sat upon his throne, a monument of shifting, living ice that responded to his will. Even seated, he was a towering figure, his silver crown reflecting the glacial light. At his side stood General Amara Krieg, her face an unreadable mask carved from steel and ice. "We are at war," Amara's voice carried through the chamber, sharp, unyielding. "The recent attempt proves what I have long warned. The empire of Ziffer will not stop until our kingdom no more." Sylvain stiffened at the words. A week ago, an explosion had rocked this very hall. It had come out of nowhere, one moment. She had been standing before the court, discussing expanding diplomatic relations. And the next, fire. Not ice. Fire. Heat so intense it had shattered the palace walls, turning ice into steam before anyone could react, and her power gone. She had woken up in the medical wing, her father at her bedside, his face carved in despair. The tests had come. The results confirmed it. She could no longer wield the ice. A princess of Valharys without her power was nothing, a queen-in-waiting with no throne. Now, Amara continued, her gaze shifting briefly to Sylvain, our enemies will not wait for us to rebuild. We must act before they do. The time for half measures is over. The time for weakness has passed. A murmur of agreement rippled through the court. The whispers had already begun. A shell of what she was. Without her power, what is she? A liability? Can the king afford to keep protecting her? Her father's voice cut through the noise, low but ironclad. No one will take my daughter's place. Not while I still draw breath. The murmurs ceased, but the doubt still clung to the air like an unshaken frost. Sylvain swallowed the lump rising in her throat. She should speak. She should demand that she still held value, that she was more than just her power. But the words stayed locked inside her, frozen in the ice of her failure. Then, the doors to the chamber swung open with a dull, mechanical hiss. A gust of wind swirled through, dragging a wave of warmth, impossible, alien heat, a presence unlike anything Valharys had ever known. The court turned as one, eyes narrowing in curiosity, silent. The figure that entered should not have belonged in this world. Tall, broad-shouldered, he was encased in dark, insulated armor designed to keep heat trapped within his own body. He walked with a measured, unhurried confidence as if the world itself bent around his presence rather than the other way around, a human. Heat radiated from him, a quiet challenge against the frozen air. Sylvain felt it before she even realized she was moving closer, an unconscious reaction, a gravitational pull toward something that didn't belong but refused to be ignored. His gaze met hers, brown eyes like burning embers in a world of endless white. "Princess Sylvain Valharys," his voice was deep-standing and eddy, carrying a weight that did not ask permission to exist. "My name is Andrew Adams. I'm here to make sure you are alive." The silence that followed was absolute. A single human in a palace of ice, a kingdom that did not welcome outsiders, a man standing where no man should. Sylvain's heart hammered against her ribs, not in fear, not in anger, in something else entirely. The room remained frozen in silence, the weight of Andrew Adams' words settling over the court like a thick layer of ice. Sylvain exhaled slowly, steadying herself as she took in the man standing before her, a human. He did not lower his gaze in deference, did not flinch under the scrutiny of a room full of nobles. Instead, he held her stare, calm, unreadable, completely unfazed by the tension thickening the air. Her father spoke first, his voice sharp as ice. "You were given your orders, Adams. Protect my daughter at all costs. Can you fulfill this duty?" Andrew didn't hesitate. "I wouldn't be here if I couldn't." There was no bravado in his tone, no attempt at arrogance, just certainty. Sylvain felt something twist in her chest, something frustratingly unfamiliar. She straightened, gathering what was left of her composure. I don't need protection, she said, willing her voice to be as sharp. Andrew tilted his head slightly, considering her. That's not what your enemies think. A flicker of heat, not the kind that radiated from his presence, but something deeper, something dangerously close to indignation. The entire court was watching, waiting for her to either accept the help or reject it and risk appearing weak. Her fingers twitched at her sides. Before she would have conjured a thin, intricate blade of ice into her palm without a thought, the cold bending to her will as easily as breathing. But now nothing. The absence of power was like a hollow space inside her, a missing limb she still instinctively reached for. She turned to her father. Surely there are better options, she pressed. I don't need a human. Perhaps not, the king replied, his expression unreadable. But you have one. The finality in his voice left no room for argument. Before she could form a proper retort, General Amara Krieg stepped forward. Unlike the others, she was not glaring at Andrew. I find it fascinating, Amara mused, crossing her arms, that the king would entrust the safety of his only heir to someone so fragile. She let the word linger, watching for Andrew's reaction. Humans aren't built for this world. You will freeze before you ever reach your blade, and the enemy will tear you apart before you do. Andrew's lips barely twitched in something that wasn't quite a smile. And yet, he said, I'm still standing here. A ripple of discomfort moved through the court. The human should have been afraid. Instead, he seemed almost bored by the display of ice. Sylvain's curiosity flared against her will. You think you can protect me? She asked, eyes narrowing. Andrew met her gaze evenly. I think you should be asking yourself a better question. She arched a brow. Which is? His expression remained unreadable, but there was something in his stance, in his presence, that made her uneasy. Then he spoke, voice steady, completely sure. Why did they take your power? A sharp inhale. The court stilled. It was a question no one had dared to ask out loud. This had been shocking, but the fact that she had survived while losing her ability to command ice, that was an enigma no one wanted to acknowledge. It was easier to pretend it was a tragic consequence, a freak accident, rather than what Andrew was suggesting that it had been deliberate. Her heartbeat pounded. Andrew did not look away, did not soften his words, did not offer empty reassurances. He simply waited. And for the first time since she had woken up feeling powerless, Sylvain felt something shift. She had assumed she had lost her power. The silence that followed Andrew's question was absolute. It didn't just settle over the court, it cracked through it, splintering the careful illusion that had been constructed around the truth. The nobles shifted uneasily, some casting quick glances at one another, others keeping their expressions blank. Even General Amara, who never showed hesitation, had gone completely still. Sylvain's fingers curled into her palms. She had spent every waking moment trying to convince herself that it was just an accident, that her powers had simply failed. Something inside her had broken beyond repair. But Andrew had said it like it was the simplest fact in the world. She forced herself to breathe evenly, to meet his gaze without betraying the way his words had unsettled something deep inside her. You assume too much, she said carefully. Andrew studied her, his dark eyes giving away nothing. Do I? A flicker of heat brushed her skin, not from Andrew himself, but from her own body. It was faint, almost imperceptible. But for the first time in weeks, she felt something shift. Not her ice, not the familiar chill of her birthright, but something else, a sensation she didn't understand. Before she could process it, the king's voice cut through the tension. That is enough. His tone was not sharp, not reprimanding, but it was final. Andrew glanced at the king but didn't lower his gaze. Your Majesty, he said, voice steady. If your daughter's power was taken, it means someone knew how to do it. And if someone knew how to do it, they might not be finished. The weight of those words sank deep. Sylvain didn't dare look at her father, but she could feel the change in the air, the way his fingers tightened on the arm of his throne. He had considered this before. He had feared it. But saying it out loud meant acknowledging a truth far worse than the one they had all accepted. Amara took a step forward, her voice controlled but edged with steel. And what exactly do you propose we do about it? Human? Andrew didn't blink. Start acting like the enemy is still here. The general let out a short breath. You are an outsider. You know nothing of our world, our laws. Your laws didn't stop them the first time, Andrew cut in smoothly. A low murmur rippled through the court, but Sylvain wasn't listening to them anymore. She was watching him. Andrew wasn't afraid of Amara. Wasn't afraid of anyone in this room. He had walked into a frozen kingdom and hadn't bowed, hadn't faltered, hadn't so much as shivered in the face of a people who saw him as a walking anomaly. The princess exhaled slowly, then turned to her father. "If he's going to protect me," she said, "then let him do it properly." The king's gaze flickered to her, a warning, a hesitation. But finally, after a long pause, he gave a single nod. Amara's lips pressed into a thin line, but she did not object. Andrew, to his credit, did not look triumphant. He only inclined his head slightly. Understood. The king rose from his throne, his presence towering even without words. "Then go," he said simply, "and find out who took my daughter's power." The court was dismissed. But as Sylvain turned to leave, she felt it again, that flicker, that strange sensation trailing behind her, faint but persistent. She hesitated, then cast a glance over her shoulder. Andrew was watching her, a question in his gaze. Her pulse quickened. Maybe this human was more dangerous than she had realized. The cold stretched endlessly. Sylvain walked through the palace halls, the ice beneath her feet whispering with every step. She had lived in this place her entire life and knew its every curve, every frost-laced pattern along the crystalline walls. Yet now, it felt like something foreign, something empty. Andrew followed a few paces behind her, his presence an anomaly against the quiet stillness of Valharys. Even without looking, she could feel the warmth radiating from him, a stark contrast to everything around them. It wasn't just the heat, though. It was the way he existed differently in this world. He did not move like someone tiptoeing across thin ice, did not hesitate as if afraid the cold would devour him whole. He moved like someone who did not care if the ice swallowed him or not. She hated that it intrigued her. The silence between them stretched until it became unbearable. "You're reckless," she muttered finally. Andrew barely reacted. "You're avoiding the real question." She turned sharply. "And what question is that?" He stopped walking, tilting his head slightly, his gaze piercing. "Do you want your power back?" The words struck something inside her. She stiffened. "Of course I do." Andrew exhaled, breath curling in the freezing air. "Then stop acting like it's already gone." A flicker of frustration rose in her chest. "You think I haven't tried? You think I haven't spent every waking moment reaching for something that isn't there?" She stepped closer, ignoring the way her pulse quickened at the heat between them. "I was born with it, and now it's just gone. You don't understand what that feels like." Andrew met her anger with steady calm. "No," he admitted, "but I know that if something can be taken, it can also be taken back." The words cut through her frustration like a blade through the ice. She wanted to argue, wanted to dismiss him, but deep down, she knew he wasn't wrong. Something had been done to her, something deliberate. And if there was one thing Sylvain refused to be, it was powerless. Before she could respond, a sharp knock sounded against the door. A royal attendant stepped inside, eyes carefully averted. "Your Highness, General Krieg requests your presence in the training grounds." Sylvain didn't move at first. Her father had permitted Andrew to protect her, but Amara still saw him as an outsider, a liability. If she was calling them, it wasn't out of respect. Andrew, however, only shrugged. "Guess we're about to find out how much they hate me." He was infuriatingly unbothered. She exhaled slowly, schooling her expression. "Let's get this over with." The training grounds were carved into the mountainside, a vast arena of reinforced ice and jagged cliffs looming beyond the palace walls. The cold was sharper here, the air thinner. Warriors trained in disciplined formations, their movements fluid despite the heavy armor of their station. At the center stood General Amara, arms crossed, waiting. Around her, a dozen of Valharys' most elite soldiers lingered, their expressions unreadable. Sylvain did not hesitate as she approached, but she could feel Andrew scanning the scene, calculating. Amara's gaze flicked toward the human. "If he is to be your protector," she said evenly, "then he should know what he's protecting you from." Sylvain had expected a test, but she hadn't expected this. The soldiers moved into position, 12 against 1. Andrew didn't look surprised. If anything, there was something almost amused in the way he exhaled, rolling his shoulders. "You sure you want to do this?" he asked. A soldier lunged. Andrew shifted, moving fast, too fast for someone wrapped in layers of winter armor. He sidestepped at the last second, grabbing the soldier and sending him sprawling onto the ice. Sylvain barely had time to process the movement before two more rushed him. For a moment, she thought he might falter. that sheer numbers would overwhelm him. But Andrew fought differently than the soldiers of Valharys. They were used to measured, precise combat, fighting with the grace of those who knew they had power at their disposal. Andrew fought like someone who had never had power to begin with. He moved through them, shifting, redirecting, never meeting force with force. He wasn't trying to overpower them. He was making them overpower themselves. One soldier went down, then another, and another. The last remaining warrior hesitated, and that was all Andrew needed. He stepped in, closing the distance in an instant. In a single, calculated motion, he swept the soldier's legs from beneath him, sending him crashing onto the ice. Then, everything was silent. Amara's expression didn't change, but Sylvain could see it, the slightest flicker of something beneath the surface. Andrew exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. So, do I pass? A long pause. Then Amara nodded. For now. She turned to Sylvain. A war is coming. We cannot afford weakness. Her gaze flickered briefly to Andrew. Do not let him make you one. With that, she walked away, leaving Sylvain alone with the human who had just humiliated her kingdom's best warriors. Andrew sighed. You know, he muttered. That went better than I expected. Sylvain should have been angry. She should have been frustrated that he had proved them all wrong so easily. Sylvain stood at the edge of the palace walls, the bitter cold pressing against her skin, but she barely felt it because something was wrong. Andrew stood beside her, his breath curling in the freezing air. They're here, he murmured. The words barely left his lips before the ice cracked. The explosion was sharp and sudden, a blast of heat and force that sent shards of frozen stone flying. Then, out of the shadows, they came. Cloaked figures moving too fast, too fluidly, their shapes barely visible against the ice. This wasn't an army marching to war, this was a surgical strike. A precise, calculated invasion. The palace alarm screamed. Guards surged into motion, formations shifting, barriers of ice erupting from the ground to block the path. They moved through the storm like they were part of it, their weapons cutting through the frost-wrought defenses, as if the ice itself refused to obey its masters. They were the ones who had taken her power. She reached for the ice, for the cold that had always been hers to command, but nothing came. Her breath hitched. Not now. Not again. Andrew was already moving. He shouldn't have been faster than the Valharian warriors and shouldn't have been able to keep up with the sheer speed of the enemy. But somehow, he was. He met the first assassin head-on and forced them off balance. His movements were fluid and precise, not like someone overpowering his opponent, but someone redirecting their force against them. Another came from the side. Andrew spun, ducking beneath the strike and countering, sending the attacker staggering. But there were too many. Sylvain barely had time to react before another figure broke through the defensive line, heading straight for her. She moved on instinct, twisting away from the first strike, but the assassin was relentless. They lunged again, blade flashing under the pale moonlight. Then Andrew was there. He grabbed her arm, pulling her back just as the blade sliced through the air where she had been standing. Too close. She felt the heat of him, the raw intensity of his presence against the frozen world around them. And for the first time in so long, the ice inside her didn't feel cold. It felt alive. A second attacker came from the side. Andrew barely had time to turn before the hit. Sylvain felt it before she saw it. The moment he hurt, the heat around him faltered. He stumbled. Her pulse roared in her ears. Something inside her snapped. The ice didn't just return, it exploded. A shockwave of frost erupted outward, tendrils of ice spearing through the air with impossible speed. They in front of her barely had time to react before the frost caught them mid-motion, freezing them in a place like a sculpture carved from the very essence of winter. The entire battlefield stilled. For the first time since the attack, since the day she had woken up powerless, she could feel it again. Her breath came fast, ragged. The ice was listening to her. But it wasn't the same. It wasn't the cold, lifeless power she had known all her life. It was something new. She turned to Andrew, who had dropped to one knee. His breathing was shallow and uneven. The needle in his armor gleamed unnaturally against the moonlight. Panic surged through her. "Stay with me," she whispered. Andrew let out a rough breath, his eyes flickering toward her. "I'm not going anywhere." But she could feel it. The warmth of him was fading. She dropped to her knees beside him, hands pressing against his chest. The cold had always been her weapon, her shield, her very essence. But now, as she reached for her power. It was not ice that answered. It was heat. Not the raw, but something different. Something gentle, steady, unshakable. She had spent so long fearing warmth, but now it was the only thing that could save him. She didn't think. She just acted. The ice around them cracked, a shimmering mist curling from the frost as something new took shape. A soft, golden glow flickered in the air, radiating outward from where her hands met his skin. For the first time in history, a princess of Valharys wielded something other than the cold. The ice did not vanish. It did not melt. It shifted and became something new. Andrew's warmth pushed back, a force unlike anything she had ever known. His breathing steadied. The color in his skin returned. When his eyes opened, they locked onto hers, something unreadable flickering behind them. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, finally, Andrew exhaled a quiet laugh. "So," he murmured, "guess I'm not the only one breaking the rules around here." She let out a sharp breath, somewhere between a laugh and something dangerously close to relief. Then she turned toward the battlefield, where the remaining assassins were beginning to realize what had just happened. The Princess of Valharys had her power again. And this time, she wasn't just fighting with ice. She was fighting with everything. The battlefield was silent. For the first time since the fight began, the enemy hesitated. They had come expecting a weak princess, a kingdom left fractured by doubt. They had come expecting an easy, but what they faced now was something they did not understand. Sylvain stood at the center of it all, her breath coming in short, controlled bursts, her hands still tingling with the aftershock of what she had just done. The ice at her feet shimmered, no longer a cold, lifeless expanse, but something alive, shifting with the pulse of her heartbeat. It wasn't just ice anymore. It wasn't just cold. It was power. A fusion of everything she had once been and everything she was becoming. Not just the cold, but the warmth that made it meaningful. Andrew stirred beside her, his voice hoarse but steady. "They're regrouping." She could see it. The enemy had survived the initial wave of her power, weaseling back, calculating, reassessing. They had lost the element of surprise. They had lost control, and they were afraid. Sylvain lifted a hand, fingers flexing as the air around her shifted. The ice did not freeze solid this time, it flowed, bending to her will, moving like liquid mercury beneath her feet. The same way fire could consume, her ice now adapted, a storm of her own making. She took a step forward. The assassins took a step back. Andrew let out a low chuckle. "I think they're starting to regret their life choices." She almost smiled. Then, from the far end of the battlefield, another sound split through the night. A voice cold, calculated, and familiar. "You've changed, Your Highness." General Amara Krieg stepped forward from the shadows. The remaining assassins did not move. They did not need to, because Mama had been orchestrating this from the beginning. Sylvain ran cold, but not from fear. Not anymore. "You were behind this," she said, and it wasn't a question. Amara's expression was unreadable. "Did you think your father's paranoia was misplaced?" she said lightly. "This kingdom is soft. It has been for too long. I simply accelerated what was already inevitable." Sylvain's fingers twitched at her sides. She could feel the ice waiting, responding, begging to be unleashed, but Amara was not finished. "Your power was never meant to return," the general said, tilting her head slightly, studying her like she was a puzzle that had solved itself incorrectly. "And yet, here you stand, whole and changed. Do you even understand what you've done?" Sylvain held her ground. "I took back what was mine." Amara's lips curled in something almost resembling amusement. "Did you?" Andrew shifted beside her, his stance tensing. "You knew," he murmured, "about the attack, about what they did to her." Amara didn't deny it. "Power is a burden," she said simply. "Not all who inherit it are fit to wield it." Sylvain's pulse roared. This was never about an outside enemy. This was Amara. She had been the one pulling the strings. She had been the one who orchestrated the first attack. She had been the one who had ensured Sylvain lost her power, because she had wanted her gone. And when that hadn't worked, she had let the enemy in herself. Sylvain felt the weight, but it fueled her. Andrew exhaled sharply. "We should move," he muttered, eyes scanning the battlefield. "This isn't just a fight anymore." Sylvain knew he was right. The palace was burning behind them, the lower districts in chaos. If they didn't act now, there would be no Valharys left to save. But she didn't look away from Amara. "You're a danger now," the general said, and for the first time, there was something in her voice that almost sounded like respect. You were meant to be removed. Instead, you adapted. That makes you dangerous. Sylvain lifted her chin. Then you should be afraid. For the first time, Amara hesitated, and in that moment, Sylvain struck. The ice did not come in jagged spikes. It did not freeze. It moved. A surge of frost rushed forward like a wave, swift and unrelenting, bending and twisting as it met Amara's defenses. The general reacted instantly, drawing her weapon, her frost forming a shield around her, but it wasn't enough. Because Sylvain was no longer fighting like a princess of Valharys. She was fighting like Andrew. Amara barely had time to counter before the ice shifted again, not locking her in place, but redirecting, turning her momentum against her. She stumbled, and Sylvain was there. Her hand caught Amara's wrist, and where once there would have been only frostbiting, there was the heat. It spread through the ice, through her fingers, through the storm she had summoned. Controlled, alive, a force of its own. And for the first time, Amara Krieg, the woman who had built herself into something untouchable, flinched. Sylvain met her gaze and whispered, "Power isn't a burden." Then she let go. The storm carried Amara backward, crashing into the frozen ground. Her weapon skidded across the ice, out of reach. She did not rise. The remaining assassins did not wait for orders. They turned and vanished into the blizzard, their mission abandoned. The battle was over. The air was still, but Sylvain felt everything. Her pulse was racing, her power still humming beneath her skin, but she did not collapse. She did not stumble. She stood. Andrew let out a slow breath beside her. "Remind me never to make you mad." A laugh almost escaped her, but the weight of what had just happened still pressed. Her throat tightened, but she refused to let fear win. "Stay with me," she said quietly. Andrew's gaze softened. "I already told you," he murmured. "I'm not going anywhere." Something in her chest settled. The battle had cost them more than either of them could measure, but Valharys still stood, and so did she. Not as the princess she had once been, not as the heir who had lost everything, but as the ruler who had taken it all back.